I'll make the calls myself then. Here's the shape I'm going with. Golden child, older sister, a lawyer everyone worships. Versus the narrator, the disappointment, who became a paramedic and then a fire rescue lieutenant. The evening news segment is a multi-fatality highway pileup rescue where the narrator pulls a school bus driver and kids out of a burning vehicle, caught on a bystander's phone and picked up by the local news, then national. Ending is bittersweet. Mom partially reconciles, sister never really does, and the narrator is at peace without forcing closure. This will be a long, single, continuous narration. I'll write it directly here in the chat rather than as a downloadable file, since it's a story to read use as a script, not a formatted document. Let me know after if you'd like it as a Word doc or Markdown file instead. I found out my sister called me the family charity case at our own engagement party. And I found out because she didn't realize I was standing close enough behind the cheese table to hear every word. It was October. My mother's good china was out, and there were maybe 40 people crammed into my parents' living room toasting Rachel and her fiancé Marcus, a guy who did something in commercial real estate that nobody in my family fully understood, but everyone respected anyway, because he wore a blazer to a backyard engagement party, and that apparently meant something. I was holding a plate of brie and crackers I didn't even want, just something to do with my hands, when I heard my Aunt Denise ask Rachel, low and conspiratorial, the way people ask questions they already know are a little rude. And what's Casey up to these days? There was a pause. Not a long one, just long enough. Oh, she's still doing the ambulance thing, Rachel said. And I could hear the smile in her voice. The practiced pitying smile she used when she talked about me to people who mattered. We keep hoping she'll go back and finish her degree. You know, eventually. Aunt Denise made a sympathetic noise. Mom and Dad don't really bring it up anymore, Rachel went on. I think they've just accepted it. She's kind of the family charity case at this point. We love her, obviously. She just never figured out what she wanted to do with her life. I want to tell you, I walked over and said something devastating, something cool and composed that shut the whole conversation down and made Rachel feel 2 inches tall in front of our aunt. I didn't. I stood there holding a plate of cheese I didn't want, frozen, while my face did something I couldn't control. And by the time I decided to move, Aunt Denise had already pivoted to ask about the wedding venue, and the moment had closed over like water. I put the plate down on the bookshelf next to me, found my coat, and left without saying goodbye to anyone. I told my mother I had a shift, which wasn't true. I just didn't trust myself to be in that house for one more minute without crying in front of 40 people, and I had already decided a long time ago that I would rather die than cry in front of my family. I drove home with the radio off. I do that sometimes when I need to think, when the silence is the only thing that can hold whatever's happening in my head. And what was happening in my head was this. I had been an EMT for 6 years. I had been a paramedic for 4 of those. 8 months earlier, I had been promoted to lieutenant at Station 14, which, if you don't know how fire rescue ranks work, is not nothing. It's not the ambulance thing. It's not the ambulance thing. It's not charity. I had taken the lieutenant's exam twice, failed it once by 4 points, studied for 9 more months while working full shifts, and passed it the second time with one of the highest scores in the department's history for a female candidate, a fact my captain liked to bring up sometimes, a little proudly, like he'd had something to do with it. My family did not know that. My family did not know the test existed. My family, as far as I could tell, did not know what I did between the hours of 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. on the days I worked, except that it involved an ambulance and was, by their estimation, a placeholder for the real life I would eventually get around to building. I want to be fair to them, or at least I want to try, because that's the only way any of this makes sense later. My parents are not cruel people. My mother cries at dog food commercials. My father coached Little League for 9 years for kids who weren't even his. They are not villains in the way villains and the Wayans exist in movies, with a clear motive and a clean reveal. They are just people who decided very early on that there were 2 kinds of accomplishment in the world, the kind Rachel had and the kind that didn't count. And once they decided that, they never really revisited it. Rachel went to law school. Rachel passed the bar on her first attempt. Rachel got an associate position at a firm downtown that did, from what I understood, mostly corporate mergers. The kind of law that doesn't involve a single courtroom but involves an enormous amount of money changing hands quietly. Every single family dinner from the time she started that job involved at least one update on Rachel's cases, sanitized for confidentiality, delivered with the gravity of a State of the Union address. My mother kept a folder, an actual physical folder of newspaper clippings any time Rachel's firm got mentioned in the business section, even when Rachel's name wasn't in the article. Just the firm's name was enough. I had asked once early on if I could talk about a call that had gone well. A pediatric save, a kid who'd gone into cardiac arrest at a pool and come back, breathing on his own in the ambulance before we'd even reached the hospital. A genuinely rare, good outcome that the whole crew had been buzzing about for days. I'd barely gotten 2 sentences out before my father redirected the conversation to ask Rachel about a closing she'd had that week. I don't think it was deliberate. I don't think he even noticed he'd done it. That's the part that took me years to understand and even longer to stop being furious about, that the dismissal wasn't usually an attack. It was just an absence of curiosity, repeated so many times it became its own kind of message. So by the time I was 29 years old, sitting in my car outside my own apartment with the engine off because I wasn't ready to go inside yet, the ambulance thing had become the official family designation for my entire adult life. 6 years of 12-hour shifts. 4 years as a paramedic working some of the worst calls a person can work and still go home and make dinner like everything's fine. 8 months as a lieutenant, responsible now for a full crew, for training, for the kind of decisions that get reviewed afterward by people whose job it is to make sure you didn't get someone killed. All of that collapsed into 3 words delivered to a room full of relatives like a punchline. I didn't cry that night, for the record. I want that on the record. I sat in my car for 20 minutes, and then I went inside and I made myself a grilled cheese sandwich and I watched half an episode of something I don't remember, and I went to bed because I had a shift the next morning at 7. And unlike apparently everyone in my family, I took my job seriously enough not to let an engagement party wreck my sleep before a 12-hour shift where people's lives might actually depend on whether I'd gotten rest. I didn't know yet that 4 months later, a stranger with a phone in his hand, standing on the shoulder of Route 9 in the freezing rain, was going to change every single thing about how my family talked about me. I didn't know that the same aunt who'd asked, "What's Casey up to?" with that particular tone was going to see my face on the actual evening news, in grainy bystander footage, pulling a screaming 9-year-old out of an overturned school bus 40 seconds before the engine compartment went up in flames behind us. I didn't know any of that yet. I just made my grilled cheese and went to bed and told myself, the way I'd told myself for 6 years, that it didn't matter what they thought, because I knew what I did. I told myself that lie so many times I'd almost gotten good at believing it. The accident happened on a Tuesday in February, the kind of February where the sky never really commits to being light, just shifts from one gray to a slightly different gray and calls it a day. We got the call at 3:52 in the afternoon. Multi-vehicle collision, Route 9 northbound near the Cumberland overpass, reports of the school bus involved, reports of fire. Dispatch's voice had that particular flatness that EMS dispatchers get when they're trying very hard not to let you hear how bad it might be, because panic in their voice becomes panic in yours, and panic in yours becomes a slower response. I was lieutenant on Engine 14 that day, riding with Marcus, not Rachel's, Marcus, a different Marcus. We had 2 on shift, and it had been a running joke for years. And Priya, who'd been a paramedic for about 18 months and still had that careful, deliberate way of doing things that hadn't yet hardened into instinct. We rolled out with Engine 14 and Medic 7 right behind us, sirens up, and on the drive over, dispatch updated us twice. First, that there were at least 3 vehicles involved, then that the bus was on its side and there were children trapped, conscious reports coming from inside. I want to describe what that drive feels like because I think it's the part people understand the least about this job. It's not adrenaline in the way people imagine adrenaline, all jacked up and electric. It's the opposite. Something in you gets very, very quiet. You start running through scenarios almost mechanically. Extraction tools, triage order, who's driving versus who's working the patient compartment, what the radio traffic from other units is telling you about resources already on scene. Priya was quiet next to me, hands folded in her lap, and I remember looking over at her and saying, "We're going to be okay, just follow the sequence," which was as much for me as it was for her. We came around the overpass and I saw it before dispatch needed to tell us anything else. The bus was on its side in the median, half crumpled against the guardrail, and there was a sedan underneath the rear axle at an angle that meant someone in that car had had an extraordinarily bad afternoon. Smoke. Not yet fire, but smoke, thick and gray and rising from somewhere near the bus's engine compartment, was already curling up into that flat February sky. There were maybe a dozen civilians standing on the shoulder, several with phones out, one man in a flannel jacket already at the bus's emergency window, trying to pry it open with his bare hands, which is exactly the kind of well-meaning thing that gets people killed at scenes like this, but which also told me there were people inside who were responsive enough to be reaching for him. I'm not going to walk through every single minute of what happened next, because if I did this, story would turn into a procedural and lose the thing that actually matters. But I'll tell you the parts that stayed with me. I'll tell you that there were 19 kids on that bus, ages 6 to 11, on their way back from a regional spelling bee, and that the driver, a woman named Teresa who'd been driving that route for 11 years, had a femur fracture so severe that later, at the hospital, one of the trauma surgeons would tell me it was one of the worst closed fractures he'd personally seen, and that she had stayed conscious and talking to the kids the entire time, telling them help was coming while her own leg was bent at an angle a body isn't built for. I'll tell you that the smoke turned out to be coming from a fuel line that had been compromised in the initial impact, and that our incident commander, a 30-year veteran named Walt Greer, who does not get rattled by much, looked at that bus and made the call that we had a window, not a long one, to get kids out the rear emergency door before he'd commit to letting anyone go in through the front, where the fuel smell was strongest. I'll tell you that I went in through that rear door with Marcus right behind me into a space that was sideways instead of upright, which does something strange and disorienting to your inner ear that no training fully prepares you for, and that the kids were stacked against what had become the floor, the sidewall, in a pile of backpacks and spelling bee trophies, and one girl's retainer case that had popped open and scattered everywhere, and that the first thing I said to them, the very first thing, before anything tactical, was, "Hey, I need everybody to look at me, not at the smoke, look at me." I'll tell you that we got 14 kids out through that rear door in just under 4 minutes, passing them hand to hand down the line we'd formed. Marcus to me, to Priya, to 2 civilians who'd had the sense to actually help instead of just film. And that somewhere in the middle of that, Walt's voice came over the radio saying we had maybe 90 seconds before he was pulling everyone back, regardless of what was left inside, because the fuel smell had gotten worse, and a battalion chief who'd just arrived agreed. And I'll tell you that the last 2 kids weren't near the rear door. They were near the front, tangled together near where Teresa was pinned, a boy named Eli, who'd broken his wrist, and a girl, 9 years old, whose name I learned later was Maya, who had not made a sound the entire time, not one, who I found out afterward had been in shock so total that the EMS report described her as minimally responsive to verbal stimulus, which is a clinical way of saying that a 9-year-old had gone somewhere inside herself that none of us could reach with words. I went forward instead of back. I want to be honest about this part because I've thought about it 1,000 times since, and I still don't fully know if it was the right call by the book, only that it was the call I made. Marcus called out that we were past the 90 seconds, that Walt wanted us out, and I told him to get the boy Eli because the boy could move under his own power if guided, and I went for Maya myself because she couldn't. She didn't fight me, and she didn't help me either. She was a dead weight in the particular way that shock makes a body heavy, not limp exactly, just unresponsive to its own situation. And I had maybe 20 feet to cover with her in my arms over wreckage that kept shifting under my boots. And I remember thinking, with a strange removed clarity, that if the floor gave way at the wrong angle, we were both going down with it. We made it out the rear door 11 seconds according to the timeline they put together afterward, before the engine compartment ignited. 11 seconds. I didn't know it was 11 seconds until I watched the footage later, because in the moment it wasn't a number, it was just heat on the back of my neck and Marcus's hand grabbing my collar to pull me the last few feet clear, and then the sound, a sound I still hear sometimes when I'm trying to fall asleep. A low whump that you feel in your chest more than your ears, as the front of that bus went up. Maya didn't make a sound even then. She just looked up at me finally, eyes finding mine for the first time since I picked her up, and said, in this small, flat voice, "Is Mrs. Teresa okay?" I told her Mrs. Teresa was being taken care of, which was true, because 2 other medics had gotten Teresa stabilized and extracted from the driver's compartment through a totally separate operation I hadn't even had bandwidth to track while it was happening. I carried Maya to the triage area myself and didn't put her down until a pediatric trauma team had hands on her. And then I went back, because there was still a scene to manage and a crew to account for and 3 other vehicles I hadn't even gotten to yet. What I didn't know in any of those minutes was that the man in the flannel jacket, the one who'd been trying to pry the window open with his bare hands before we arrived, had pulled out his phone the second our truck rolled up and had kept it recording for the entire 11 minutes we were on that bus. I didn't know that his footage, shaky and out of focus and absolutely real in a way that no professional camera crew could have faked, showed me coming out that rear door with Maya in my arms 11 seconds before the fireball. I didn't know that he posted it to a community Facebook group that night captioned, "Local fire rescue saved my niece's whole bus today," not knowing he was about to set off a chain of events that would end with a film crew from the regional news affiliate calling our station the next morning, asking if Lieutenant Casey Hartwell would be willing to do an interview. I said no, the first time they asked. I want that part understood clearly because I think it matters for what comes later. I am not a person who wanted this. I have never wanted this. I've worked calls that were worse than that bus. Calls nobody ever heard about, calls where things did not go well, where I went home and didn't sleep and didn't talk about it to anyone, and the idea that this particular call, a call where, yes, it had gone about as well as a call like that can go, would suddenly be the one people wanted to talk about felt almost grotesque to me. Like the job only counted when there was footage. Walt was the one who talked me into it, actually, sitting across from me in his office 2 days after the accident, coffee going cold between us. "You don't have to do it for you," he said. "Do it for the department. Do it for the next budget vote, when the county's deciding whether Station 14 gets the new extraction equipment we've been asking for since I had hair. Public goodwill matters for that stuff, Casey, whether it should or not." So I did it. I sat down in my dress uniform in front of a reporter named Diane Okafor, who I'd later learn had covered fires and floods and one particularly bad chemical spill for almost 15 years, and had a way of asking questions that didn't feel like an interrogation, just felt like someone genuinely wanting to understand what had happened. I told her about the rear door, about the sequence, about Marcus and Priya and the 2 civilians who'd helped form the line. I made sure, 3 separate times in that interview, to redirect credit toward the whole crew, because it wasn't a one-person rescue. It had never been a one-person rescue, and I did not want to be the story. I did not get my way on that last part. The segment aired on a Thursday at 6 p.m. I wasn't watching it live. I was at the grocery store. I remember that very specifically, standing in the cereal aisle trying to decide between 2 brands of granola, completely unaware that my face was on television at that exact moment with bystander footage of me carrying a 9-year-old out of a flaming bus. My phone started buzzing in my pocket around 6,008, and by 6:15 it would not stop, and I stood there in the cereal aisle scrolling through 11 missed calls and 40-some texts, trying to figure out what on earth had happened, half convinced for a horrible 30 seconds that something had gone wrong, that someone had died, before I understood it was the opposite. It had gone right, publicly, undeniably right, and apparently the entire town had feelings about that. The first call I actually picked up was from Priya, who was laughing so hard I could barely understand her. Casey, oh my God, turn on Channel 6. You're a whole human being on the news right now. They're calling you a hero. My mom just called me crying. I want to tell you, my first feeling was pride. It wasn't, not exactly. My first feeling, standing there with a box of granola in my hand, was a strange, hollow kind of dread, because some instinct in me already knew exactly what this meant for the conversation that was coming with my family, and some other instinct in me, the uglier one, the one I'm not proud of but won't pretend wasn't there, was already, helplessly, wondering what Rachel was going to say. My mother called 4 times before I called her back. When I finally did, she picked up before the first ring had even finished, which told me she'd been sitting there with the phone in her hand. "Casey." Her voice did something I hadn't heard it do in longer than I could remember. It cracked. "Casey, we just saw the news. Your father and we were eating dinner, and the segment came on, and I didn't recognize you for a second, and then I did, and She started crying. My mother, who cries at dog food commercials but somehow had never once cried, in 6 years about anything related to my actual job, was crying on the phone because she'd seen 40 seconds of bystander footage on the local news. "Why didn't you tell us you did things like that?" she said once she'd gotten some control back. "Casey, why didn't we know?" And I want to be honest, because this story doesn't mean anything if I'm not honest. That question made me angrier than almost anything else that happened in the entire aftermath. Because I had tried to tell them at dinners, at holidays, in the small openings that conversation sometimes gives you, and every single time the subject had been redirected, gently or not so gently, toward Rachel's latest closing, toward the thing that counted. The information had never been hidden from them. It had simply never been wanted, and now that it had a television segment attached to it, now that strangers in a Facebook group thought it was worth caring about, suddenly they wanted to know why they hadn't known. I didn't say all of that on the phone. I said something smaller, quieter, that I think communicated maybe 60% of it anyway. "I did tell you, Mom. Nobody ever really asked." There was a silence on the line that told me she'd heard the 60%, even if she wasn't going to engage with it that night. Rachel texted me at 9:40 that evening. I'd been waiting for it, in the specific way you wait for a phone call you don't actually want to answer but can't stop checking for anyway. "You just saw the news segment. You're famous, LOL. So proud of you. Always knew you had it in you." I read that text probably 6 times. Always knew you had it in you. 4 months earlier, she called me the family charity case to our aunt in a voice dripping with performed pity. The kind of pity that requires an audience to function, and now, with one viral clip behind me, I apparently had it in me all along. I didn't respond that night. I told myself it was because I was exhausted, which was true, but it wasn't the real reason. The real reason was that I didn't trust what I would say if I let myself answer honestly. And some old, tired part of me still wanted to be the bigger person, still wanted to not be the one who started something at a moment when, technically, nothing had gone wrong between us. Nothing had gone wrong. She just sent a nice text. That's all it was on the surface. It was only underneath the surface that 6 years of the ambulance thing sat curdling. The segment didn't stay local. That's the part nobody warned me about because nobody could have predicted it. The bystander footage, the actual raw clip, not even the polished news package, got picked up by a national morning show's social media account 2 days later. The caption, something like, "Firefighter races against the clock to save trapped child seconds before bus explodes." And within about 36 hours, it had several million views. And within a week, I'd done 2 more interviews I genuinely didn't want to do, including one with a producer from a national outlet who used the word viral so many times I started keeping count. My captain told me attendance at our department's annual fundraiser had nearly tripled from the year before. Walt got his extraction equipment approved at the next budget meeting, no debate, which I think was secretly the only outcome out of all of this that he personally cared about. Maya's mother found my email through the department and wrote me a letter that I still have, that I will have until the day I die, that I am not going to describe here because some things are mine and not for telling. Teresa, the bus driver, sent flowers to the station with a card that just said, "Thank you for staying calm, so I didn't have to be the only one." And my family, who for 6 years had not asked me a single real question about my work, suddenly could not stop talking about it. The dinner happened 3 weeks later. My mother organized it, called it a celebration dinner, which was its own small, strange irony, because we had never once had a celebration dinner for a promotion, a save, a commendation, any of the actual milestones I'd quietly accumulated over 6 years. We were having one now because of a clip on the internet. I almost didn't go. I want to be honest about how close I came to just not going, to sending a text saying I had a shift, the same lie I'd told the night of the engagement party. Except this time it would have been a real escape instead of a small one. Priya talked me into going, actually in the break room at the station 2 days before. "You should go," she said, not looking up from the patient report she was finishing. "Not for them. Go and watch what they do. You'll learn something." I didn't fully understand what she meant until I was sitting at my parents' table watching it happen in real time. My father had printed out an article, an actual physical printout, the way my mother used to do with Rachel's firm mentions, about the rescue, and he put it on the table by my placemat like a place card. My mother had made a cake, white frosting, my name written on it in blue icing, the first cake anyone had made for me since probably my 16th birthday. My Aunt Denise was there too, invited specifically, my mother admitted later, because she'd want to hear about it, and I thought about the cheese table at the engagement party and had to take a long drink of water to keep my face from doing anything. "Tell Aunt Denise about the part where you went back in," my mother said, beaming, cutting the cake. "Tell her about the little girl." And here's the thing I noticed sitting there that I don't think I would have caught if Priya hadn't told me to watch. My mother wanted the story. She wanted the highlight reel, the dramatic beat, the moment that had been on television. She didn't ask about the 9 months of training before that. She didn't ask what the lieutenant's exam involved, or what a normal Tuesday looked like for me, or what it had been like to fail that test the first time and have to decide whether to try again. She wanted the nationally televised 40 seconds, retold at her table, for an audience. It wasn't curiosity about my life. It was appetite for a story that now had value because other people had decided it had value. I told the story anyway, the sanitized version, the version with the good ending, because Maya was fine now, Teresa was recovering, Eli's wrist had healed, and there's no point being bitter in front of a cake with your name on it in blue icing. But partway through, Rachel said something that I've turned over in my head more than almost anything else that happened in that whole period. "It's so funny," she said, not unkindly, just thoughtlessly, the way people say things when they've never had to examine an assumption because nobody ever pushed back on it. "We always just figured the ambulance thing was kind of a placeholder, like a job, not a career. I guess I never really got what the ranks even meant. We always just figured. 6 years of figuring. 6 years of a working theory about my life that nobody had bothered to test against any actual information because the actual information had simply never been requested. You could have asked," I said. It came out quieter than I meant it to, but it came out. Rachel blinked. "Asked what?" "What the ranks meant. What I do. Any of it. You could have just asked at any point in the last 6 years." The table went a little quiet. My father cleared his throat in the specific way he does when he wants a subject to be over. My mother's smile got that brittle holding pattern quality I recognized from 100 other family dinners where something true had threatened to surface and everyone in the room had silently agreed to let it sink back down instead. Well, we're asking now, Rachel said with a little laugh, like that settled it, like the 6 years prior simply didn't need accounting for once the present had been corrected. I let it go that night. I want to be honest about that too. I didn't deliver some triumphant speech. I didn't make anyone cry. I didn't get the satisfaction of watching Rachel's face fall the way you'd want it to fall in a story with a tidier ending. I ate my cake. I told the version of the story that fit the room. I drove home afterward with the radio off again, doing the thing I do when I need to think. And what I thought, somewhere around the highway exit near my apartment, was that I didn't actually want an apology anymore. I'd wanted one for years, I think, in some buried, embarrassed way. And now that the opportunity for one was sitting right there on the table, available, I realized I didn't trust it to mean anything even if it came. An apology that only exists because a clip went viral isn't really about me. It's about the clip. Here's where this story doesn't tie up the way the YouTube version of this story usually wants it to. My mother changed genuinely in the months after. Not all at once, and not completely, but in small, real ways that added up to something. She started calling on my actual shift days, not just holidays, asking how a specific call had gone, asking what the new lieutenant responsibilities involved, asking real questions, and then, this is the part that mattered most, actually listening to the answers instead of waiting for her turn to mention Rachel's firm. She came to my station once, unannounced, with a tray of cookies for the whole crew and stood in our bay for 45 minutes letting Marcus show her the extraction equipment Walt had finally gotten funded, and I watched her face do something genuinely curious, genuinely engaged that I hadn't seen directed at my job in 6 years. It wasn't enough to undo everything. It also wasn't nothing. My father tried in his own more limited way. He still defaults to asking about Rachel's cases first at dinner, an old groove worn too deep to fully erase. But he started adding a second question afterward. And how's the station case? That he never used to ask at all, and from a man who's never been good at noticing his own blind spots, I've decided to count that as real effort. Rachel and I did not have a reconciliation scene. I want to tell you we did, because it would make a better ending, the kind with a bow on it, but it would be a lie, and I promised myself I wasn't going to lie in the telling of this even where the truth is less satisfying. Rachel apologized exactly once, about 4 months after the dinner, in a text that read, "Hey, I think I haven't always given you enough credit over the years. Sorry about that," which is the kind of apology that's technically an apology and emotionally nothing. The kind that costs the sender almost nothing to send and asks the receiver to do all the remaining work of believing it. I said thanks. I didn't say it was okay because it wasn't, and I'd finally gotten old enough to stop saying things were okay just to keep a room comfortable. We still see each other at family events. We're polite. She still, occasionally, can't quite resist a comment that reveals she still doesn't really understand what I do. Last Thanksgiving, she referred to my station as the firehouse you work at, like I drive the truck and that's the whole of it. And I didn't correct her because I'd run out of appetite for correcting her, and running out of that appetite turned out to be its own kind of peace. Aunt Denise, for what it's worth, sends me a card every year now on the anniversary of the rescue. I don't know what to do with that exactly, except keep the cards, because they're at least sincere even if they're 4 months too late relative to the version of her that asked what's Casey up to with that particular tone at the engagement party. I made lieutenant permanently. Obviously, that part was never in question. The promotion happened months before any of the news coverage, a fact that the local segment actually got slightly wrong in its captioning and that nobody in my family ever bothered to correct even after I pointed it out, which tells you something too if you're looking for it. Maya's mother sends me a photo every year on the anniversary, just a school photo. Maya getting taller, Maya at her own spelling bee the following spring, Maya looking nothing like the small, silent weight I carried out of that bus. I keep those too. I think about the granola aisle sometimes. I think about standing there with a box in each hand, completely unaware that 40 seconds of shaky bystander footage were about to detonate a version of my life I'd quietly accepted as permanent. The version where I was the ambulance thing, the placeholder, the charity case, the disappointment who never quite got around to a real career. I think about how strange it is that the truth of who I'd already been for 6 years needed a viral clip to become visible to the people who should have seen it all along without one. I don't know if that's a happy ending. I think it's just an ending, the real kind, the kind where some people change and some people don't, and you have to decide what you're willing to keep waiting for and what you're finally willing to let go of. My mother and I talk more now. And it's real, and I'm grateful for it even though I resent a little that it took a fire to get us there. My sister and I have an uneasy, polite truce that I no longer expect to deepen into anything else. And I've made peace with that too. And the slow, undramatic way peace actually arrives, which is nothing at all like the version they show on television. The bus is long gone, scrapped for parts. Teresa walks with a slight limp now, but she's back driving a different route. Slower, careful. And she still gets nervous on overpasses, which seems fair to me. The footage is still online if you look for it, grainy and shaking and real in a way nothing scripted ever quite manages. 40 seconds out of a 12-hour shift out of 6 years out of a whole life that was happening. Fully and completely, the entire time nobody at that table was asking,